based on some stress points that come in our lives. And we all have stress. And we've been looking at communication and talking about money, talking about kids. And today, one of the stress points, just after everything's seemingly perfect, you have a job, you graduate, you get married. What is another stress point? And it sometimes is the extended family. When you get married, all of a sudden you say, I'm married my spouse, but now I married also his or her family. And you might have found that they have weird uncles or aunts. All of us have different weirdness in our families. And if you don't think you do, then you're probably the weird one. Their lifestyle is different. Their politics are different. Their faith is different. And so when you have family gatherings, it's not always happily ever after. It's a little stressful. And you don't want that to happen, but sometimes it does. And Vicki and I, when all of a sudden our kids get married, and you thought about our in-laws, and she had my family to deal with, and I had her family to work with and deal with, all of a sudden we realized we're the in-laws. And now all of a sudden we say, well, hopefully we're not causing trouble, but there might be. You never know. And so extended family, there's a little stress in that. So how do you handle that? How do you go through these stressful points? Well, you have to first of all set up some priorities, a priority list, and then we're going to talk about boundaries that all of us should have, and hopefully they will relieve some of the stress points that come with extended family. First one you should have as you talk about extended family priorities, what should be number one, according to Genesis, as you look at this extended family, is God. God just says, no matter how many family members you have, and no matter if you're married or if you have children, I want to be number one priority. And God says that is a big deal to Him. Then the Lord God made a woman from the rib, and He brought her to the man. And just that's kind of like God saying, hey, I got this present for you, and here she is. It's like God's first relationship with both the man and the woman was with Him. He formed man, breathed life into man, said, Adam, here, let me show you this garden. Had a relationship with God, Adam and Eve. He said, look what I made you. And Adam's going, wow, this is fantastic. And then later on, He made the woman. And when He created her, the first relationship that Eve had was with God. He says, listen, I'm going to bring you to Adam and you're going to be one. And so He brought this bride to Adam and said, here, I want you to enjoy each other. But go back and realize both Adam and Eve, their first relationship was with God. God had a relationship with both of them. Created Adam, created Eve. Alone, they had that relationship with God, and God still wants to have a relationship with all of us. And sometimes we get that wrong, and if we don't get that right, a lot of things are going to be messed up in our extended family, in our life, and we just have to realize that God says, I want to have a relationship with you. And so if you fail at your relationship with God, you're going to fail with relationships throughout your life. You're going to fail with people that are close to you, with friends and family members. You're just going to fail at that because God says, I want to be first in your life. And so you just got to remember that God placed the man in the garden. He had that relationship. And God then made the woman and said, here, I want you to meet Adam. But He had a relationship with each of them, and it was a pretty big deal. But He said, listen, I want you to remember that I don't like to play second fiddle. I'll allow you to have a spouse. I'll allow you to have close friends. I will allow you to have a job, and I'll allow you to have extended family. That's all well and good, but I want you to remember me. Jesus said this, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and the greatest commandment. I mean, if you go back to the 10 Commandments, God's first commandment says, you must worship the Lord, just me alone, no one else. Worship me. Don't forget about me, the relationship you have with God. Make sure you have God as a priority. When you do that, all the other relationships become a little easier. Sometimes you look at people's priorities and say, what is your priority? Work is a priority. You'll go to work if you're sick, but you don't go to church if you're sick. It just shows where the priorities are. Schools sometimes become a priority. Children sometimes become a priority. Soccer sometimes becomes a priority. It's like, this is more important than church or God or my relationship with God, and you just got to check that in your life. You're having problems with your extended family, you say, well, I got to go back to what's most important and start to check my priorities. Do I read my Bible? Do I spend time praying? Do I go to church? And I'm speaking to you, you came to church, well done. But we're living in a culture that God is not such a big priority, even to Christians. You see other religions, and they worship gods that don't exist. But they're pretty strong in their commitment to that. They don't care who sees them praying. They'll pray wherever they are. They will tell people about their faith because it's a priority to them. We serve the living God, the creator of the universe, the one and only true God. And sometimes our priorities are just much less than people that are worshiping false gods. So God says, listen, you know who I am. I have a relationship with you. I created you. I want to be a top priority in your life. Why don't we do that? Well, Adam and Eve had this problem like we do. It's just called sin. And the relationship God had with them suddenly deteriorated because they had one rule. Don't eat from that tree, that fruit. Would that be great? You just have one commandment, that's it. You know, you don't have 10 commandments. You don't have 630, whatever they had in the Old Testament. You just had one. Just don't eat from that tree. Everything else you can do. But just stay away from there. But then they did. They ate it, sin entered the world, and from then the relationship deteriorated. What caused the relationship to crumble between them and God? It was sin. And then they had little sinners. And then those little sinners had little sinners. And later on, here we are, little sinners. And if you got married and if you've had kids, you created little sinners. And sin is there destroying relationships, all kinds, especially God's relationship. And so we just need to make sure that we watch that. Because I think the brokenness in our world, in our culture, comes from broken relationships. And the biggest broken relationship that people have is with God. And so what did Jesus do when He came into the world? He came to restore the relationship between mankind and God. He says, now you can have a stronger relationship with God because of Jesus. Jesus died on the cross for our sins. You accept that. You ask Jesus to take control of your life, and now you can have, again, a relationship, easy access to God. You don't have to go to a priest. You don't have to go to a temple. You can go and talk to God. When Vicki and I were dating, I remember I would go on these tours. I was in a choir, and we'd get mail. And I'd grab the letter and open it up, and I wanted to read what she wrote to me. It was just exciting. We were far apart, and yet we had these letters. God has given us a letter, and it's called the Bible. Often we don't read His letters. We don't read what Paul has said about God. We don't read what James said about God, or we just don't read about that. Many of us have multiple Bibles. You have multiple Bibles on your phone and easy access, but we just tend not to strengthen that relationship. And yet God says, make sure that's a big priority in your life. Number 2, if you're married, should be your spouse. God says you have been given a spouse. It's a big deal. And He says this. He says in Genesis, we read this, but when a man and a woman come together, God said this is why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. Jewish culture always had the wife leaving her family. The father or the husband, usually the son, would build an extension onto the house, and the Jewish families would live together, but the girl would leave her family and come and live with her husband, who had an extended family house. It was just a bigger and bigger house. And Jesus established something, saying, no, the son and the daughter, when they get married, they both will leave I know for men, and for me in particular, we just are so focused on life. And so we have, graduate from your school, and then find a wife and get married, and then get your job and work hard at the job and focus on that. And sometimes work becomes the priority before our spouse. For women, sometimes it's the children, and they become more of a priority than the spouse. And then the kids leave, and you find marriage sometimes has these difficult years. The first year as they adjust, and then the third year as kids are coming into their life, and the 7th year as things are changing, and then 15 years and 30 years. You go, why? Because things are changing, and sometimes the kids become so important you forget about each other, and suddenly you find yourself at home. Hi, what's your name? And you don't know one another. The third thing, the priority, is your children. You don't minimize your children. Pay attention to them. God has given to them to you. We talked about that last week. And so make sure your children are a priority, that you're teaching them the things of God. You say, God is a priority in my life. That should be a priority in your life. Adam and Eve, they had together several children, 3. And you look at this, and Cain, and then Abel, and then later on Seth. Children are a natural part of marriage, and you need to take care of them. Jesus said, go and make disciples. And I think a lot of the disciples that you have physically made, you have an opportunity to build into them some godly principles. And so realizing that you have a chance to make that a priority. The fourth priority, then after that, talking to what we're talking about today, is your extended family. Who exactly is your extended family? Well, the Bible says you got to pay attention to them. It says those who won't care for their relatives, your blood relatives, especially those of their own household who have denied the true faith. Such people are worse than unbelievers. God is saying, listen, and Paul wrote this to Timothy, a young pastor, saying, you got to care for those who are your relatives. Take good care of them. And so your relatives are blood relatives, or aunts and uncles, in-laws, people that are close to you, people that maybe you don't talk to. But the Bible is pretty firm about this, that you just care for your relatives. Back in Paul's day when he wrote this, there was no health care, there was no Medicare, there was no homes for those who are elderly that you can care for them. It was like the duty of those who are younger to care for those who were sick and getting on in life. And Paul said, listen, all of the believers, especially believers, you care for those who are getting older. And so as you set priorities, keep them in order. God, spouse if you're married, children if you have them, and then your relatives. That's the priority list. Biblically, as you look at this is how God says there are some priorities that you need to have in your life. And Jesus is even talking about setting the example when he's dying on the cross. If you remember, what did he say? He looked at John and said, take care of my mother. And he looked at his mom and said, Mom, there's your son. Now that was interesting, because John was not a blood relative. The Apostle John was a young man who loved Jesus. Jesus was the oldest of 4 brothers and 2 sisters, we at least know. And yet, when he's dying on the cross, he didn't have his brothers there and his sisters weren't there. He looked at his young disciple, John, and said, will you care for my mom? This was going beyond the blood relative thing. It was a faith connection. So caring for your extended family. Now there are wrinkles, there are stress points in doing all that. There's money and there's housing and there's time. And how do you deal with all of that? Well, we know what the priorities are, but how about some boundaries? So extended family. What does the Bible say about boundaries, and what do you do with your extended family? And so a couple of things as you set boundaries. And sometimes when you think boundaries, you say, I'm keeping people away. Well, actually, no. You're setting up some protection boundaries for you. Boundaries are mainly for you. Number one is just be confidential. Just be confidential as you set boundaries about what's going on. You don't need to tell everybody everything. Genesis says this, and we looked at this verse. This explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. And there's things that, as a married couple, you don't need to tell everybody. You don't have to tell all your best friends, do you know what my husband did? Or guys, you don't have to go tell your guys, but what happens all the time with your spouse. I've been pastoring now for 40 years, and we have kids, and even in our family, they said, Dad, when you're telling stories, I said, I will check before I tell stories, because they go, don't tell everybody everything. My son was kind of worried about that when he was in junior high. I said, Andy, can I tell this story? He goes, no. Don't tell that story. My daughters always like me talking about them. Just tell whatever you want, Dad. Talk about me whenever you want. They would love it. But my son, no, I don't want you to talk about this. Vicki and I have some stuff that you'll never find out, and our kids will never find out. It's just between Vicki and I. There's some things, hopefully, that are between you as a married couple, that you're confidential, and you just don't tell your friends. You don't tell your extended family about everything. Now, there are times that you're having problems, and what do you do with that? I think during times of problems, you got to share those problems, and maybe you have to go to a counselor, but it's good that you talk about it and go together. And then both of you are saying, let's work through some of these communication issues in our marriage, but let's do it together. And there are times you just have to be confidential and watch what you say to others. The second thing is understand and use the power of no. Sometimes we don't want to say no. Dave Ramsey says this, no is a complete sentence. No is a complete sentence. There are sometimes you just have to say no. And it's a hurtful thing, and it's tough, but it's good to say no. David wanted to build a beautiful temple for his God. And now he had a time of peace, and he says, I want to build a temple. And the prophet Nathan said, that's a great idea. Then Nathan went away from the king, and God spoke to Nathan back in the Old Testament. They didn't have the Bible. And God spoke to Nathan and said, hey, I heard that conversation. Go back and tell David, So Nathan replied to David, do whatever you might have in mind, for God is with you. But that same night, God said to Nathan, go tell my servant David, this is what the Lord has declared. You are not the one to build a house for me to live in. God said, I don't want you to build the house. I want your son to build the house. Solomon will build that temple for me. You are a man of war, and you're not to build the house for me. David's heart was right. It was good intentions. But God said, no. And there are sometimes you just have to say no. Say it with me. Ready? 1, 2, 3. No. That was good. Fridays are my day off. I try to say no to things, and I've done that for all my life when I was in ministry. When I first started as a youth pastor, Tuesday was my day off. I told my youth group, listen, on Tuesdays, my day off. So unless it's a serious problem, unless someone's died or, your leg was cut off and you're in the hospital, don't call us. Don't come over to our house. We lived in the church parsonage, and just don't come over to our house. And sometimes they would just come over, it's the middle of the day, and we go, aren't you supposed to be in school? Yeah, but, it's free time. We go, no, you're not coming. But on Tuesday, no one's coming over. Don't come over to our house. And there are times they just wander over, and we'd have to say, it's our day off. Leave. I now have Fridays for many, many years, and we just try to keep Fridays kind of different, doing something different than my regular job. We have kids now, and they grew up knowing that Friday is my day off, but then they call up, hey, Dad, could you just babysit, on Friday? Because we have to go and, I know it's Friday, but could you? And I go, it is my grandkid, I go, And for a while, Vicki and I were saying, yeah, okay, But now we have 10 grandkids, and we keep saying, and finally we just sat down again and said, you know what, we just really have to carve out Fridays just to be our time, because if not, we'll babysit all the time. Now, we don't mind babysitting, but on Fridays we just want to have that one day, and we just said we're going to have to say no. Every once in a while, it's going to be more painful than not, but we just have to say just no. And you might find yourself having to say no. It's not that you don't want to do that or be with people. It's just for your own benefit. There are times that you have to say no. No. Third thing is help but don't enable. Help but don't enable. There's sometimes you just want to help somebody in your family. And you have helped and you want to help. But sometimes you feel like the help is more enabling because they keep asking for the same thing over and over and over again. Even the Bible says a couple things. Peter wrote this to prove the truth of this proverb. A dog returns to its vomit, and another says a washed pig returns to the mud. There are times that you just have to say enough is enough, and we don't want to enable you because it seems like you're doing the same thing over and over and over. There are times that someone says, hey, can you help me out? And you want to help them out, and then something else comes up and the same thing, and it's your aunt or it's your cousin or whatever. And you've been helping all the time, and yet it goes over and over and over again. And you just have to say, you know what? I think we're going to have to say no. Because we have been helping, but it doesn't seem like it is helping. It's more enabling. Which goes a little bit with this fourth thing, don't loan money. Don't loan money. You can give money, but don't loan the money as much as you'd like to and say, you just pay it back. Proverbs says this, just as the rich rule the poor, so the borrower is servant to the lender. Something happens when there's a loan in the family. Your aunt, your uncle, your cousins, your kids, you have a good relationship, and then you loan them money, and all of a sudden, you're the bank. And they're the ones who borrowed it. Hey, how you doing? How's the money coming along? Can you pay us back? And they go, not right now. And the relationship suddenly changes, doesn't it? If you've done that, you've noticed that. And it's just, and if you borrowed money, you say, I got to pay it, I want to pay it back. And it just puts a strain on the relationship, your extended family. And as much as you can, the Bible says, just watch what you loan to your family members. Banks sometimes, they look at somebody and say, you know what, you're going to have to get a cosign on this. Because the bank have determined this person probably is going to have a rough time paying this back. So we'd like someone else to co-sign on the loan. So then they come and say, hey, can you co-sign on the loan? I don't know what the bank's thinking, but they don't think I can pay it back. And you go, oh, you can't pay it back? Sure, I'll sign the co-sign. There you go. And then you're responsible for the loan as well. And all of a sudden the relationship changes. And it gets a little tougher. And there's that tension that's in the air always. And you give the money, say, this is not a loan, this is a gift, this is what we're doing. We've done this at times, and say, here you go. And they say, we'll pay you back. You say, no, it's just a gift. You take it. And we don't expect the money to come back. It's a big, big mistake that sometimes gets us into trouble. And it's just like, we'd like to help. But then you have to go and say that word that you don't often like to say, and that's no. Now, say yes when you can and help when you can, but relationships, sometimes with extended family, money changes things. Money just changes things. It just does. You find out what people are doing, find out how much they make, find out what gift one kid's got compared to, you didn't give them the same amount of money you gave me. And then all of a sudden it just changes. And there's a little tension there. You got to go, got to be careful with the money, with your extended family. Just watch out with that. It's hard. And so the last thing, though, is accept the blessing of the wise. With your extended family, not all is bad. In fact, quite a lot is good. There's wisdom with experience. There's wisdom with age. And you sit down. I love it that my oldest daughter, Amy, she sat down once with Vicky's folks and with my mom and just wanted to know the history. Where'd you come from, as far as you growing up? And what was your high school like? And what were some of your hobbies? And she would just find out, she would just weed out all the things from our parents that we really didn't talk about. But now the next generation skips ours and they ask the other ones, how did you manage money back in the 50s? What did you guys do? What were the big problems in your life? And she was asking all these questions. I'm going, those are good questions. How come I never asked that? And she would ask questions about my dad, and I go, I don't know. And so she would find out from my mom, and I go, I never knew that. That's good stuff. It seems like skipped a generation, but there's all that wisdom, and sometimes we just think we know it all. One of the comedians said, a Christian comedian, he said, the Bible never says how old Satan was when he just defied God. He was a created angel and he wanted to become like God. It doesn't say how old Lucifer was. He says, but I'm pretty sure he was 16. Because when you're 16, you think you know it all. And you just don't want to have anything to do with those who have a lot to do with your creation. And he says, sometimes we just think we know it all, but just get some of the wisdom from some of the people that are around you. If you're blessed still to have some older relatives around, you can still talk to, it's just great. A wise person, and hopefully you want to be wise. What does a wise person do? Is hungry for knowledge, while the fool feeds on trash. You say, you know what? I just want to learn some stuff from you. And just ask them. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came up to Moses and said, man, you're leading 2.5 million Jews, people out of it, and everyone's coming to you with the authority of, they have problems and disputes and extended family issues and spouse issues and money issues, and you're the only one they're coming to. You're going to kill yourself. You need to set up a series of individuals who are wise and that people can go to. Groups of 50 go to this person. Other groups of 50 go here. And if it's a bigger matter, they can go up. You don't need to see every dispute and settle all these arguments. And Moses goes, that's a good idea. And so he put his father-in-law's ideas into place. Moses realized his father-in-law had a good idea. And sometimes as grandparents, and you're the wise ones, your grandkids will listen to you, and you'll say the same things as their parents, and yet you say it in a way that they'll listen to. And you can be a benefit and a help to your kids, supporting them, saying the same things in a slightly different way, and your grandkids will say, oh, okay. Grandma and Grandpa said this, I'm going to listen to them. Even though you're not blood related, you can serve as a wise and helpful person. My parents moved to Chicago when I was in junior high. My two sets of grandparents, I just had a grandma. My grandpa had died. I never knew him. He died early. But my other grandparents, Grandma and Grandpa, were in New Jersey. My other grandma was in New York, stayed in New York, Rochester. And we're in Chicago. We didn't have grandparents. But someone in our church saw us. Our family had 4 kids, and they once in a while just invited my dad, who was on staff at a church, and mom, and the 4 kids come over for dinner. And they sit down, and the grandpa would talk to us, and the grandma would sit. And I remember she gave Vicky cooking lessons when we were engaged, say, hey, Jim's going to love this, and she showed her how to cook it, and you still remember that. And it was just like, these were our adopted grandma and grandpa, and they've always been close to us, always been friendly to us and helpful, and yet they weren't blood relatives, but they just were part of that. And you can step in sometimes and just be part of that to people that perhaps need someone to come along. It's just amazing. So as you look at boundaries and where you're at, and you go, well, what kind of priorities and what kind of boundaries do I need to set in my life? And His wisdom has given us an extended family to buffer the bumps of life. And so we have almost 2 generations of kids. You know, kids are growing up, they have parents, and then they have grandparents. They have uncles, and you have maybe some adopted aunts and uncles. And this extended family is a good thing. God realized how important family is. He says, you need this buffer zone so you're not going through the world alone. And if you're single, God has given you the family of God and friends to just be that cushion of just going through life with relationships. Relationships are important, most important in life. Your relationship with God, relationship to your spouse, your kids, and your extended family. And God has given us those relationships to benefit our life.